On Thanksgiving night, my brother raised his glass, looked straight at me, and said, "You're just the man with the hammer, nothing more." The words landed harder than any blow my hands had ever taken on the job. Around the table, laughter rippled like it was nothing, like it was a harmless joke, but I felt the sting cut deep. They didn't see me as a father, a brother, a builder of futures. They saw me as labor, disposable, replaceable, a pair of hands meant only to lift and carry. I sat there in silence, my knuckles resting on the wood of the table, and for the first time in years, I realized that in their eyes, I was not a man of dignity, but a shadow in the corner, someone who worked while the real men spoke. For years I had carried that weight, quietly. They never asked how the walls stood, only that they were there. They never wondered who laid the bricks, only that the house was warm when winter came. They looked through me, past me, as though my very presence was a reminder of something too raw, too uncomfortable, that their comfort had been built on someone else's sacrifice. And because they didn't want to look at the cost, they buried me in invisibility. I remembered the countless mornings I left home before dawn, boots crunching on frost, hammer at my side like a second heartbeat. I remembered the nights I staggered back long after the world had gone quiet, shoulders burning, lungs heavy with dust, hands stiff from steel and stone. And yet, despite every hour, every callus, every roof raised against the storm, they spoke of me as if my life began and ended with the swing of a hammer. They thought my work was just noise, not voice, just muscle, not mind. That night, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my glass or my voice. I just sat there, my silence a wound no one saw. But inside, I carried a fire, because I knew something they didn't. Every wall I built carried a name. Every bridge I helped raise carried a legacy. Every structure that still stood against the wind was not just concrete and steel. It was proof. Proof that my life had not been small. Proof that even in the shadows, my hands were writing history one beam at a time. And what none of them could know, what not even I could predict, was that one day the world would speak back. That one day the voice of the highest office in the land would break through the silence they left me in, and in front of the whole nation, my name would be called. They thought I was just the man with the hammer, but soon they would learn that even the quietest builders leave echoes that reach farther than they could ever imagine. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your own life, when your work or sacrifices were overlooked? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. By doing so, you're helping us grow this channel and bring even more powerful stories to life. And now, let's continue. At the next family dinner, the wound they had opened on Thanksgiving was torn wider. The table was heavy with food, candles flickered, laughter bounced around the room, but beneath it all I felt a tension building, as if everyone was waiting for the moment someone would say something sharp. It didn't take long. A cousin leaned back in his chair, wine glass in hand, and with a grin that carried no warmth, he said, "You build houses, sure, but when the roof is done, who remembers your name?" The words seemed to hang above the table like smoke. Forks paused, eyes darted, but no one stopped him. Some even chuckled softly, as though it were clever, harmless. But to me, it cut deeper than a nail through skin. It wasn't just a joke, it was a sentence. In his eyes, in all their eyes, my life's work had no permanence. My sweat, my years, my sacrifice, all of it reduced to something temporary, invisible once the paint dried and the windows closed. I wasn't a man, a father, a builder of futures. I was a tool, a pair of hands used and forgotten once the job was finished. I chewed my food, slow and bitter, pretending not to hear, but inside, the storm rose. They thought I didn't understand legacy. They thought I was too small, too simple, to matter beyond the walls I raised. But I knew better. I had seen the children running through the halls of schools I helped construct, their laughter echoing against walls that would stand long after I was gone. I had seen the sick carried into hospitals I laid brick by brick, healed under roofs my hands had secured. I had watched families move into homes where love grew because I had poured the foundation with my own sweat. They said no one remembered my name when the roof was finished, but what they didn't see was that my name lived in every life sheltered beneath those roofs. Yet still, sitting at that table, what hurt most was not his words, but their silence. My daughter lowered her eyes. My brother reached for another slice of bread. My own blood, my own kin, chose not to speak. They let the insult linger, as though it were true, as though it were safe to believe that my life was nothing more than wood and nails. That silence was worse than laughter. It was a quiet agreement, a collective dismissal, and it struck me harder than any insult shouted in anger ever could.
I wanted to rise, to shout, to tell them what it meant to carry the weight of generations on your back, to hold dignity in calloused hands, to know that every scar on my skin was a chapter in the story of our family's survival. But I didn't. Instead, I swallowed the words like stones. I let the silence grow, because I knew that no defense, no explanation could tear down the walls they had already built in their minds about me. They believed I was small, and nothing I said could change that. That night, as the plates emptied and laughter returned, I sat in the same chair but felt 1,000 miles away. Around me were the people I had worked for, sacrificed for, built for, and yet I had never felt so unseen. They would forget my name, they said, but the irony, the cruel irony, was that they had already forgotten it while I was still sitting in the room. And still, deep inside, I carried something they could never touch. The certainty that truth has its own timing. One day my name would be spoken in a place where none of them could ignore it. Not in this dining room, not in the whispers of family, but on a stage so vast that even their silence could not cover it. They believed I was a man destined to be forgotten, but the world had already been writing a different ending for me. The silence that followed that dinner was heavier than the words themselves. Silence has a way of saying what mouths refuse to admit, and that night it roared louder than any insult. My cousin's remark had cut me, yes, but the deeper wound came from the ones who sat nearest to me, those who should have stood, who should have said something, who should have defended me, not because I needed protection, but because I deserved truth. Instead, they chose stillness. Their eyes dropped to their plates, their hands busied themselves with bread and glasses, and in that avoidance, I heard their verdict. They agreed. Maybe not in their hearts, maybe not consciously, but in that moment their silence confirmed it. My labor was something less. My life, in their eyes, was not a legacy, but a tool they had already put away. I looked around the table and saw the evidence of my own work everywhere. The roof above us? I had patched it one winter when the snow threatened to break through. The very table where they leaned their elbows? I had built it from oak, sanded it until it shone. The walls that carried their laughter, the floor beneath their feet, the warmth that wrapped the house. All of it had passed once through my hands, yet no one seemed to notice. They had long since grown blind to the scaffolding that carried them, deaf to the sound of nails driven into beams, indifferent to the ache in my back that had given them comfort. Familiarity had made them forget, and now, silence sealed the forgetting like a coffin. It is one thing to be dismissed by strangers, by men in suits who never knew what it meant to sweat for survival. That wound is shallow. But when your own blood, your own family, the very people you rose early and stayed late to protect, choose not to see you, there is no deeper cut.
That night, I realized I no longer had respect within my own home. The house I built with my labor no longer carried the weight of gratitude. It was simply a stage where others performed their ambitions, while I lingered as background noise. I excused myself early and stepped outside. The cold night air hit me like truth, raw and undeniable. I sat on the porch, staring at my hands in the dim light. They were rough, scarred, lined with years of work, and in them I saw the entire story of my life. Every sacrifice, every broken bone, every roof raised against the storm. Yet inside that house, those hands were invisible. They saw only the dirt, the calluses, the marks of labor. They did not see the dignity. They did not see the promise I had kept, day after day, year after year, to give them a life stronger than the one I was born into. As I sat there, I felt a strange stillness inside me. Not despair, not anger, something quieter, heavier. It was the moment a man finally accepts that honor in his own family may never come. And yet, deep beneath that heaviness, a flame still burned. Because respect denied is not respect lost. Respect waits. It waits for truth to rise, for the world to bend, for the silence to break under the weight of reality. That night, under the stars, I whispered a promise to myself. If my own house refused to see me, then one day another house, larger, louder, the house of the nation itself, would. And when that day came, the silence of my family would no longer matter. They had written their verdict. But life was still preparing its appeal. It became a pattern after that night, one I knew all too well. Whenever I found myself among neighbors, relatives, or acquaintances, the conversation seemed to circle around the same things: politics, finance, real business. They spoke with a self-importance that filled the room, voices sharp, laughter easy, hands gesturing like they held the world between their fingers. They would talk of mergers and stocks, of candidates and campaigns, as if the future of nations rested in their casual debates. And then their eyes would drift to me, the man with dirt under his nails, the man whose shirt carried the faint smell of lumber or concrete even after washing. Their smiles softened, tilted, became the kind reserved for children or the elderly. That look of pity, of quiet dismissal, cut deeper than any word. To them I was the man in the hard hat, nothing more. A figure bent over beams, a faceless worker lost in the sea of laborers who kept their cities upright. They thought my world was dirty work, a realm of sweat and grime beneath their polished shoes. They never asked what I had built, never asked what sacrifices I had made. They only saw the surface, hands scarred, shoulders stooped, boots worn through, and in their eyes, that meant smallness. They believed real power lived in boardrooms, not in the steel skeletons of bridges. They believed real legacy was signed with pens, not carved into stone by hands. I listened to their words, sometimes even nodded, though each syllable weighed against me like a stone in my chest. They carried themselves like kings, but I could see the hollowness beneath it. Their victories were numbers on paper, fleeting, fragile, subject to the rise and fall of tides they did not control. My victories stood against storms. My victories carried families across rivers on bridges I helped raise, carried children into classrooms inside schools I had laid brick by brick, carried the sick into hospitals where beams I had bolted held firm above their beds. Their laughter could dismiss me, but their world still leaned on mine, though they pretended not to notice. At home, the echo of their condescension followed me. My daughter would repeat some line her husband had said about future investments, as if it were gospel. My brother would scoff and say that one day I would wish I had chosen something bigger. They didn't understand. My work was not small. My work was the skeleton of their big. Without foundations, towers crumble. Without roofs, families scatter. Without walls, The great speeches they worshipped would echo into nothing. But their words, their looks, their smirks, they gathered inside me like stones in a pouch, each one heavy, each one pressing down on my chest. They thought they were speaking casually, thought their judgment was subtle, but I felt the weight of it all the same. I became the man they could laugh at gently, the man they could smile at while quietly dismissing, the man who never quite belonged at the table where they measured themselves in profits and power. And yet beneath that crushing weight, another force stirred. They thought their stones would bury me, but they were only building a wall behind which my resolve grew stronger. Because every time they looked at me with pity, every time they dismissed my work as small, I remembered the truth. Small things are the bones of greatness. A single beam holds a roof. A single brick begins a tower. A single hand builds a legacy that outlasts kings. One day I knew their stones of mockery would become the very foundation of my vindication. For when the world finally spoke my name, when the highest voice in the land lifted it from the shadows, those same people would realize the man they dismissed, the man in the hard hat, had built more than they could ever claim with their empty talk. And then their pity would turn into silence, their laughter into shame. When the sting of their words grew too heavy, I would retreat into memory, and in those memories I found the truth they refused to see. I had not spent my life just building walls that held out the wind or roofs that kept out the rain. I had built bridges that carried families across rivers that once divided towns. I had raised schools from bare ground where children who had nothing but dirt beneath their feet now learned to write their names against chalkboards bright with possibility. I had helped erect hospitals where the sick were carried in with fear and carried out with hope, where mothers held newborns beneath ceilings my hands had secured. My life was not a string of projects. It was a map of survival, a hidden line of victories etched into the bones of cities and towns. I remembered the long nights on the riverbank, cold mud clutching my boots as we drove the foundations of a bridge deep into the earth. We worked with lanterns burning low, the water biting at our ankles, but we stayed until the pilings stood firm against the current. Months later, when the bridge finally opened, I stood in the distance and watched a boy on a bicycle ride across it for the first time, his laughter carried by the wind. No one clapped for me, no one spoke my name, but I knew. That laughter was my monument. That child's freedom was my reward. I remembered the school, a patch of land where weeds grew higher than a man's waist. We cleared it with our hands, sweat stinging our eyes, backs bent under the weight of timber and stone. And when the walls rose, when the bell tower finally stood, the sound of that first bell echoed across the valley. Children ran in, clutching books too big for their arms, eyes wide with a kind of wonder you cannot buy with money. I watched from the shadows, leaning against the fence, invisible. But inside me something swelled that no applause could equal, because I knew I had not just built a building, I had built a future. And then, the hospital. That was the hardest one. We worked through the winter, snow falling through holes in the unfinished roof, our breath freezing in the air as we laid brick after brick. Many nights I thought my body would break under the weight, but I kept going because I knew what it meant. Years later, I walked by and saw a mother stepping out the front doors, cradling her baby against her chest, tears of relief shining in her eyes. She never looked my way. She didn't know who I was, but the beams I had bolted held above her, keeping her safe, giving her life, where once there had been only despair. These were not just buildings. They were testaments. They were living things, breathing long after my shift had ended. Each one held stories I would never hear, lives I would never meet, but they stood as silent proof that my hands had mattered. They thought I had only built walls, but I knew I had built something greater: memory, security, hope. I had built the stage upon which generations would stand, even if they never knew my name. So when they mocked me, when they said no one would remember, I carried these images inside me like secret treasures. Because I didn't build for fame. I didn't build for applause. I built so that people could live, so that children could learn, so that families could survive storms they didn't even see coming. And though the world ignored my name, the world walked every day on the foundations I had laid. That was enough for me. Or at least it had been. Until the day came when the silence was finally broken, and the world itself was forced to remember me. One evening I sat in the quiet of my living room, the television flickering in the corner, when the news anchor's voice caught my attention. They were showing images of a bridge, steel arches glinting in the sun, crowds gathered with flags waving, speeches being given beneath the structure. My bridge. I knew every beam, every joint, every line of that creation because my hands had lived inside it for months, because my sweat had been mixed into its cement. My heart stirred with recognition, and for a fleeting second I thought perhaps, just perhaps, this was the moment someone would finally say my name. But then the anchor smiled and said it lightly, almost carelessly. Built by a hard-working crew, a dedicated team, some local brigade. Just like that, a faceless label. My work, my years, my soul reduced to a nameless crew. They cheered for the mayor who cut the ribbon, for the official who spoke about vision, for the investors who stood in polished shoes. But the builders, the real builders, were shadows in the background, blurred in the camera's eye. I leaned closer to the screen, as if by force of will I could hear the words unsaid, but they never came. They erased me with silence, and in that silence I felt the kind of burn no fire could match. It was not just the absence of my name, it was the erasure of my life. I had given myself to that bridge. I remembered standing in the rain at 3 a.m, tightening bolts with fingers so numb I could barely feel the wrench. I remembered the wind whipping across the river, threatening to throw us from the scaffolding, and still we stayed, still we worked. I remembered the weight of fear when one of the supports shifted under the strain, and how I climbed down myself to brace it, knowing if it failed, men would die. Every part of me lived in that bridge, but to the world, watching on television, it had appeared from nowhere, built by some brigade. I sat back in my chair, hands trembling against my knees. My chest ached with more than anger. It was grief. Because what had been stolen was not applause, but acknowledgement that I had existed at all. To erase a man's name from his work is to steal his place in the story, to bury him alive in silence. They had not just ignored me, they had stolen my voice, my legacy, my truth. In that moment, the faces of my family flashed in my mind. My daughter's silence, my brother's smirk, the neighbor's pity. Perhaps they had been right all along. Perhaps I really was just another pair of hands, destined to be forgotten the moment the last nail was driven. The thought sat heavy on me, like a weight pressing into my lungs. And yet, as the bitterness spread, a different thought began to burn beneath it. If they would not say my name, then I would carry it myself. If they thought I was invisible, then one day I would become undeniable. Not by force, not by begging, but by the simple, unstoppable power of truth. Because truth, no matter how long it is buried, has a way of rising. The bridge stood, the school stood, the hospital stood. They could erase my name from the broadcast, but they could not erase the steel, the stone, the lives saved beneath it. One day, I told myself, the silence would break. And when it did, the world would hear what they tried to forget. That night, I turned off the television and sat in darkness, the glow of the screen still burning in my mind. They had stolen my voice in front of millions, but the story was not over, not yet. While the world erased me with a single careless phrase, the men who had stood beside me on those long nights did not forget.
They carried my name the way only laborers do, quietly, without ceremony, but with the kind of weight that cannot be taken away. I began to hear it in fragments, whispered back to me through old colleagues who still walked the factory floors, who still leaned against half-built walls with dust on their boots. That was him, they would say when the bridge appeared on television. That was the man who kept it from collapsing when the storm hit. That was the one who hauled cement in the dead of night when the rest of us thought we couldn't go another hour. Those words never reached the broadcasters, never filled the airwaves. But they filled something inside me that had been hollowed out by silence. Because I knew the truth. A name written in headlines fades, but a name spoken with respect, by men who bled beside you, is carved into eternity. These men remembered the night I climbed the scaffold, when the winds howled like wolves, when the entire frame shuddered and everyone else froze in terror. I had moved without hesitation, tightening cables with frozen hands, anchoring the structure when it could have fallen into the river and taken us with it. They never forgot. Even years later, the story lived in their voices. They remembered the nights when paychecks were late, when families wondered how they would eat, and still I stayed, mixing cement long after the lamps should have gone dark. They remembered the morning I showed up with a busted knee, refusing to let the crew down, dragging timber across the site until my leg nearly gave out. They remembered because they had been there, because they had seen what it cost. And while the cameras focused on ribbon cuttings and smiling officials, these men knew where the real backbone of the work had been. One day, I walked past a site where younger workers were gathered. They didn't recognize me at first. Age had bent my back. My hair had gone to ash. But when my name was spoken, something shifted. One of them straightened. Another nodded, as though he had heard the stories passed down. And then came the words that struck me deeper than applause ever could. That's him. No titles, no fanfare, just 3 words. But in those 3 words, I felt the echo of my past rise up like a tide, proof that invisibility was only an illusion. The world may choose to forget, but the ground does not. The steel remembers the hands that set it. The stone remembers the sweat that stained it. And the men who carried the same burdens remember the brother who never let them fall. My name was not on the screen, not in the speeches, not in the neat plaques unveiled for the cameras. But my name lived where it mattered, in the memories of those who knew the truth. That realization steadied me. Their echo was stronger than the silence of my family, stronger than the indifference of officials. Because memory born in blood and toil cannot be erased. And even as the world ignored me, I knew that somewhere, in the hearts of men who had built with me, my name was alive. And one day, that echo would rise louder than the erasure. One day, it would reach beyond the job sites and the scaffolds, beyond the shadows they kept me in. And when it did, no one would be able to silence it again. I sat in the dim light of my living room, the glow of the television flickering across the walls I had once painted with my own hands. The broadcast showed men in suits, smiling wide, shaking hands as though their grip alone had lifted steel and poured foundations. Cameras flashed, capturing their polished shoes stepping across the bridge I had built, their rehearsed speeches ringing with pride that did not belong to them. They spoke of vision and leadership, of the boldness to dream, as if they had stood in the storm, as if they had bent their backs under the weight of stone and steel. They claimed my sweat with their words, turned my years into their applause. And I sat there, silent, as though I had never existed. It was the kind of silence that does not feel empty but suffocating. Every cheer that rose from the crowd felt like a nail hammered deeper into my chest. Every handshake between officials was another brick in the wall that shut me out from the very thing I had given myself to. They took my work and wore it like a crown, while I sat in a chair too old in a room too quiet, watching strangers live the recognition I had never once asked for but had always deserved.
It was as if I had died and left behind monuments that no one would tie to my name. The bitterness crept into me slow, like smoke filling a room. I remembered each night on that bridge, my boots slipping on wet girders, my lungs burning with dust, my fingers cracked and bleeding as I tightened bolts in the freezing dark. I remembered the fear that one mistake could kill men, the endless responsibility of knowing that others trusted me to hold the line when the work grew dangerous. And now, on the screen, that risk, that devotion, that quiet endurance was erased with a smile, erased with the wave of a politician's hand. No one in my house spoke my name. My daughter sat with her husband, eyes fixed on the television, nodding as the officials praised themselves. My own family listened to strangers claim my victories, and not one of them turned to look at me. That cut deeper than the erasure on screen. Because when even your blood chooses the lie over the truth, it feels as though your very life has been stripped away. I wanted to shout at the screen, to remind them all that buildings do not rise because of speeches, that bridges do not stand because of money alone. They stand because men like me gave their bodies to them, because we stayed when others went home, because we bled and carried and endured. But no one would have heard me. The world does not hear the builder. It only sees the ribbon cutting, the ceremony, the polished shoes. So I sat back, swallowed the grief, and let the silence wrap around me like a shroud. They could take the stage. They could take the credit. They could take the applause. But what they could not take was the truth. And the truth burned in me like a coal, steady and unyielding. I had built something they could never erase, no matter how hard they tried. Still, as the broadcast ended and the crowd's cheers faded into the night, I felt smaller than I had ever felt. Forgotten. Buried. The man who had held up so much, now left in shadow. And in that darkness, I asked myself the question no builder ever wants to face. If the world refuses to see the hands that hold it up, does the work still matter? And then, in the quiet of my own breath, I heard the answer. Yes. Because the bridge still stood. The school still taught. The hospital still healed. My name might have been absent, but my work lived on. The world could silence me, but it could not silence what I had built. I just didn't know then that one day the silence itself would shatter and the truth would be spoken aloud for all to hear. The day it happened began like any other, gray and ordinary, filled with the kind of silence I had grown used to carrying. I had finished my chores early, brewed a cup of bitter coffee, and sat down in my old chair with the television murmuring in the background. I wasn't even listening at first. It was just another speech, another round of applause for men in suits who had never dirtied their hands, another performance staged for cameras. But then the screen shifted, and I saw it. The bridge. My bridge. Its steel arches stretched across the river, gleaming beneath the sun, steady, proud, alive. For a heartbeat I simply stared, my chest tightening, my breath caught. And then the words came. The president's voice, clear and deliberate, rang out. This bridge stands today because of the hands and dedication of men like Paul, men whose names are too often forgotten when the work is done. My name, spoken aloud, spoken not in a break room, not in whispers among workers, but across the nation, carried on live broadcast into homes, into offices, into the very rooms where people had once laughed at me. My name, tied not to silence, not to dismissal, but to recognition. For a moment, the world seemed to fall still. Even the air in the room grew heavy, as though time itself had paused to let the words sink in. I gripped the arms of my chair so tightly my knuckles whitened. I wasn't a man given to trembling, But my body betrayed me, my hands shaking as though every scar, every blister, every wound remembered the weight they had borne. My name, my life, had broken through the wall of silence. I thought of the nights on the scaffold, the winters spent bent over steel, the blood that had dripped unnoticed into cement. And now, at last, someone saw. Not a neighbor, not a relative, but the voice of the country itself. I thought of my family, sitting at their own screens, hearing it too. I wondered if my daughter's eyes widened, if my brother's smirk faltered, if the cousin who mocked me with his glass of wine suddenly felt the taste turn sour in his mouth. They had said no one would remember me, that builders disappear when the roofs are finished, but now the highest voice in the land had spoken against them, had given me back what they had stolen, my dignity, my place in the story. Tears burned the corners of my eyes, though I refused to let them fall, not because I was ashamed, but because I knew these were not tears of weakness. They were tears of release, of vindication. The years of silence, the decades of erasure, the weight of mockery, they broke apart in that moment like a dam giving way to a flood. For the first time, I felt the world not turn past me, but toward me. The president continued speaking, his words rolling across the airwaves, but I barely heard the rest. My mind was fixed on that single instant, the sound of my name pronounced with reverence before the nation. I whispered it back to myself, hardly believing it was real. Paul, not the man with the hammer, not some brigade. Paul. That day was decisive not because the world suddenly loved me, but because it could no longer pretend I didn't exist. The silence was broken. The truth had been spoken, and once truth steps into the light, it cannot be sent back into the shadows. The phone rang, sharp and sudden, slicing through the silence of my small living room. I almost didn't pick it up. The number flashing on the screen was unfamiliar, official-looking in a way that made me hesitate. For a second, I thought it must be a mistake, some wrong connection, some telemarketer dialing into the wrong life. But something in me stirred, something that said, "Answer." My hand shook as I lifted the receiver, the weight of it far heavier than it had ever been. "Mr. Paul," a steady voice said, formal but urgent. "The president would like to speak with you, right now, on live television." The words hit harder than the clang of any steel beam I'd ever dropped. My breath caught in my chest, and for a moment I could hear nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding like a drum against my ribs. My knees weakened, and I sank back into the chair, gripping the armrest to steady myself. I had faced storms on half-built rooftops, dangling on scaffolds with the wind threatening to tear me loose. I had stared into danger with nothing but grit to keep me steady. But this moment, this simple voice on the phone, felt heavier than all of it combined. Not fear. No, not fear. It wasn't that. It was the weight of being seen, of being summoned out of the shadows into a place where every eye would turn, every ear would listen. It was the realization that after decades of silence, the story of my life, my work, my hands, was about to be spoken, not in whispers, not in small circles, but in front of a nation. I looked down at my hands, those same hands that had been mocked at family dinners, the same hands covered in scars and calluses, the same hands that had bled into concrete and burned against steel. They trembled now, not because they were weak, but because the truth they carried was finally rising to the surface. Every line, every mark etched into my skin was no longer just a record of survival. It was a testimony, about to be read aloud for the world to hear. The voice on the line waited, calm but expectant. I couldn't even form words at first. My throat felt tight, the air heavy. Finally, I managed to whisper, "Yes." A simple word, but in it lived every sacrifice, every long night, every insult endured. It wasn't just consent, it was a declaration, a statement that I was ready, even if my voice trembled, even if my knees felt unsteady. The thought flashed across my mind, of all the faces who would be watching. The neighbors who had turned away, the relatives who had laughed, the men who thought laborers disappeared into dust, and above all my daughter, my family, the ones who had let the silence sit like judgment. They would all see this. They would hear not just the president, but me. They would be forced to reckon with the truth they had buried under ridicule. The operator's voice came again, softer this time, almost reverent. "Please hold. The president will be with you shortly." And as I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, the world outside my window unchanged, just trees swaying, just the fading hum of traffic, I realized everything inside had shifted. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't just the man with the hammer. I was the one whose name had been spoken, the one whose story could no longer be erased. In that moment, trembling hands and all, I understood. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive in courtrooms or in loud arguments. Sometimes it comes in the quiet ring of a phone, in the voice that tells you your silence is finally over. The line clicked, and then came a silence so heavy it felt like the world had stopped breathing. A heartbeat later, a voice filled it. The unmistakable, measured, deliberate voice of the president of the nation. Calm, steady, carrying the weight of millions of ears listening. And then, in front of all of them, he said my name. Not the name of a company, not the name of some faceless team, not the vague dismissal of a group of workers. He spoke my name. The sound of it seemed to echo, louder than thunder, louder than machinery, louder than the jeers I had swallowed for decades. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I thought I might not be able to hold the phone. The room blurred at the edges as tears welled up, hot and uninvited, but unstoppable. I wasn't just being recognized. I was being pulled out of the shadows, out of the corners where they had tried to keep me. For once, the truth had been lifted onto a stage I never thought I would stand on. The president didn't just say my name. He thanked me. Directly. He spoke of the bridges that held, the schools that rose, the hospitals that became sanctuaries for strangers. He said those things had not been built by policy, not by signatures on paper, but by men like me, men whose hands were scarred and steady, men whose sweat had become invisible ink holding together the story of a nation. And at that moment, every slight, every dismissal, every laugh at the lowly worker was answered with a voice that could not be argued with. I felt my shoulders straighten as if the weight I had carried for years was slowly lifting. My hands still trembled, but now with something new, dignity, raw and undeniable. I thought of all the nights I had come home late, too tired to speak, clothes soaked in dust while others dined and laughed. I thought of the conversations where they looked past me, the dinners where my name never made it into the stories worth telling. And now, here it was, ringing across living rooms, offices, coffee shops, and crowded streets. My name, carried on a current no one could silence. I pictured my daughter sitting somewhere, watching, perhaps stunned into stillness. I imagined the son-in-law who had once mocked my calluses, frozen now as he realized the very thing he despised was being honored before the world. Maybe neighbors leaned closer to their televisions, whispering to each other in surprise. Maybe old friends who had forgotten me felt a flicker of shame. And somewhere deep inside, I let the moment wash over me, not with vengeance, not with bitterness, but with the quiet vindication of truth revealed. This was not about fame. It was not about power. It was not about revenge. It was about dignity, about knowing that the years had not been wasted, that the sweat had not dried in vain, that the work of my life had not disappeared into silence. The recognition was not a crown on my head, but a light over everything I had carried. It said, "You were not invisible. You were not nothing. You mattered." And for the first time in a long, long while, I believed it. The silence that had once been my cage began to crack. It was not loud at first. just a shift in the way people looked at me. The same neighbors who once walked past with polite indifference now stopped, their eyes uncertain, their words careful. At the store, a man who had laughed years ago about the hammer never making history reached for my hand, his grip trembling, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw you on TV." He could not finish. He did not need to. I could see the weight of his unspoken apology, pressing down on him harder than any tool I had ever carried. Even in my own family, the walls of silence began to crumble. My daughter, who had once lowered her gaze when others mocked me, now lifted her chin when I entered the room. She didn't need to say anything. Her eyes carried a different truth, an admission that respect, once buried under layers of shame, had risen again. My son-in-law, who had called my work dirty, no longer spoke of business or politics when I was near. His arrogance had drained from him like rainwater from a cracked bucket. He had seen the truth on that broadcast, and it was a truth he could not twist, not this time. And the whispers grew. Old colleagues called. Men with rough hands and tired backs, who had walked the same long roads of labor, spoke with a pride that had been missing for years. "They know now," one of them said, his voice breaking. "They know what we are." It was not just my name the president had honored. It was every unseen hand, every invisible worker who had been dismissed as ordinary, forgotten as background. For them, my moment was theirs too. But the ones who had mocked, who had dismissed me, who had erased me in conversations, they could not meet my eyes anymore. They shifted in their chairs. They avoided me at gatherings. They smiled too quickly, too falsely. Their silence was no longer a verdict against me. It had become their own sentence. For years, I had borne the weight of invisibility. Now, it was they who carried the shame of blindness. I thought back to the dinners where my voice was drowned out, to the television programs where my work was attributed to some crew, to the countless conversations where I was background noise. All of that had shattered in a single moment when truth had been spoken into a microphone and carried across a nation. The silence was broken, and once silence breaks, it cannot be rebuilt the same way again. That night, I sat on my porch, looking at the scars on my palms under the porch light. Once people saw those marks as dirt, as the stain of a lower life. Now I saw them as scripture carved into flesh, the handwriting of sacrifice, of perseverance, of dignity. And finally, the world had been forced to read it. For the first time, I felt a peace that was not born of endurance, but of vindication. They could no longer ignore what my hands had carried. They could no longer bury me beneath silence. The silence was gone, and in its place stood truth. Her words did not come easily. They trembled in the air like something fragile, something she had carried for years but never dared to release. "Dad, I'm proud of you." Just 5 words, but they broke through a wall I had carried inside me longer than I wanted to admit. For years, her silence had been a weight heavier than bricks, heavier than beams, heavier even than the endless nights on scaffolds when the city slept and I worked under a flickering lamp. Her silence had been the real labor, the real punishment, building walls between us that no hammer could ever break. And now, in an instant, those walls crumbled. I saw her differently then, not as the little girl who once held my hand, not as the woman who had sat at the table while others mocked me and looked away, but as someone rediscovering her own reflection. Because the truth is, when she had let them belittle me, she had also let them belittle a part of herself. My labor had raised her, fed her, carried her through storms she never even knew raged around her. And though she had forgotten, deep down she knew. Her shame had not been mine. It had been hers. And now, at last, she was letting it go. Those words were not just about me. They were about a daughter finding her way back to her father, about a heart that had been bent by the weight of other people's laughter, finally standing upright again. She spoke softly, but I could hear the breaking of chains in her voice. It was the sound of healing, the sound of generations realigning themselves after years of silence. And in me, something shifted too. I had always told myself I didn't need their recognition, that the roof over their heads was thanks enough, that the food on the table was gratitude in its own form. But the truth is, every father longs to be seen by his children. Every father carries that secret ache, wondering if the sacrifices were noticed, if the years were remembered. I didn't need the president to speak my name, not for myself. What I needed, what I had always needed, was for my daughter to look at me with pride instead of pity. When she did, it was as if the years of calloused hands, bent back, and weary steps had finally been given meaning in her eyes. The scars no longer felt like burdens. They became medals, each line a story, each bruise a testament. And for the first time, I realized I was no longer carrying them alone. She carried them now too, not as shame, but as honor. I closed my eyes and let the words settle deep into me, into the places that had been hollow for too long. I'm proud of you. It wasn't just her voice. It was the voice of every sacrifice I had ever made finally speaking back to me. And in that moment, I felt richer than kings, stronger than monuments, more eternal than the bridges I had built. Because I had built something higher than concrete, higher than steel. I had built a legacy that had finally been seen by the eyes that mattered most. They had worn their pride like armor, walking into banquets, standing on stages, accepting applause that was never meant for them. For years they lived comfortably under borrowed light, repeating the same phrases, our team, our effort, our design, as if repetition could make the lie true. And perhaps for a while it worked. Cameras flashed, politicians smiled, newspapers printed their names. But pride built on theft has cracks, and cracks always spread. When the president spoke, when the nation heard my name for the first time, those cracks widened into a collapse no patch could cover. The spotlight they had once stolen turned harsh, illuminating their borrowed crowns for what they were: plastic, fragile, laughable. They had to stand there and face the truth that their power was hollow. It was not their hands that carried bricks in the rain, not their backs that bent under iron beams, not their nights that froze in the cold winds of unfinished roads. It was mine. And without that truth, they were nothing but words dressed in expensive suits. I didn't gloat. That is not the nature of dignity. But I watched the silence around them grow heavier each day. Men who once filled rooms with their boasting now looked away when my name was spoken. Women who once laughed at my calloused palms could no longer meet my daughter's eyes. The applause they had stolen grew quiet, replaced by whispers, whispers that traveled through streets, markets, and homes. It was him all along. The pride they once clung to slipped through their fingers like sand. They tried to hold it, to reshape the story, but the truth had already taken root in the hearts of people. Every road passed, every bridge crossed, every school bell that rang became a testimony, not to their speeches, but to my hands. Their names, once printed in bold, now faded in memory like chalk in the rain. My name, once ignored, was now etched silently into the steel beams, the foundations, the very bones of the country. It is a strange thing to witness the fall of borrowed pride. It doesn't happen with an explosion, not with shouting or scandal. It happens in the quiet moments, in the way a crowd no longer turns toward them, in the way their voices no longer carry authority, in the way the very walls they claim to have built seem to echo another name, mine. And perhaps the greatest justice was this: I never had to raise my voice, never had to demand my place. The truth stood on its own, like the buildings I left behind. Their pride crumbled, not because I fought them, but because time and truth were heavier than all their pretenses. And when false crowns fall, they do not break quietly. They shatter, loud enough for everyone to hear. In that silence, after the shattering, I finally breathed free. My dignity had never left me. It had only been waiting for the world to open its eyes. The evening was quiet. the kind of quiet that carries the weight of years. I sat on the porch, the boards beneath me worn by time, and watched as the horizon bled into colors only the patient can see. Somewhere beyond the trees, in living rooms and kitchens across the country, my name was being spoken. Not in anger, not in ridicule, not in dismissal, but in respect. For the first time, the truth that had lived silently inside me was carried on the voices of others. And I didn't need to say a word. I thought of the years when those same voices had been sharp, when laughter had filled the air like knives, slicing away at the dignity I carried quietly in my calloused palms. I remembered the dinners where I was invisible, the holidays where my labor was reduced to jokes, the way my own family sometimes bowed their heads in shame when others sneered. They thought I was small because my work was silent. They thought I was weak because my tools were simple. They thought I was expendable because I left no speeches behind me, only bricks and beams. And yet here I was, older, weathered, and still standing, while their false pride had already crumbled to dust. I did not feel the satisfaction of revenge. That is fleeting, a fire that burns too quickly and leaves only smoke. No, what I felt was something deeper, a calm, steady current of justice. Because justice is not about humiliation. It is about light breaking through shadows. It is about truth rising to the surface when lies can no longer hold it down. They had tried to silence me with arrogance, to erase me with indifference, to bury me with their words. But you cannot erase the foundations on which you walk. You cannot bury the hands that held you up. As I looked at the fading sun, I realized I had never been just building. Every wall I raised carried the memory of sweat and sacrifice. Every bridge I laid across rivers carried the hope of children crossing to school. Every nail I hammered into wood carried the steady beat of dignity that would not surrender. They saw concrete, they saw steel, they saw roofs. I had been building something greater. Memory, respect, the invisible future of a country that now, finally, remembered who had given it shape. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Not applause, not fame, but the quiet certainty that when I was gone, when time itself had moved on, the world would still walk across the work of my hands. Children would laugh in schools I helped raise. Families would pray in hospitals I helped build. Strangers would meet on streets that began with my labor. Long after my name was no longer spoken, my work would still whisper in every brick, every beam, every foundation that stood against the storms. The truth had risen, justice had spoken, and I, sitting on that porch with the evening air wrapping around me, understood the weight of it all. I was never just a builder. I was never just a pair of hands. I was a keeper of dignity, a craftsman of futures, a quiet architect of memory. And that, higher than any roof, stronger than any stone, was what I had built all along.